Some stories begin with ambition. Others begin with tragedy. The story of Winchester Mystery House begins with loss, quiet, overwhelming, and permanent. Before the house became famous, before the myths, before the staircases that lead nowhere, there was a woman who outlived everyone she loved. Her name was Sarah Lockwood Winchester, the fortune she never asked for. Sarah Winchester did not build her wealth. She inherited it. Her husband, William Wirt Winchester, was the heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, one of the most powerful firearms manufacturers in American history. The Winchester rifle had transformed warfare, expansion, and industry. It also produced unimaginable profit. When William Winchester died of tuberculosis in 1881, Sarah inherited a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in modern value. She also inherited something far heavier: grief. Only years earlier, Sarah and William had lost their infant daughter, Annie, to illness. By the time Sarah found herself widowed, her family line had ended. No husband, no child, no future she had imagined. What remained was money and silence. Grief with no social language. In the late 19th century, grief was expected to be controlled. Widows dressed in black. They withdrew from society. They endured. Sarah Winchester did exactly that. She became reclusive. She avoided public life. She traveled constantly, never settling, never allowing herself to remain still long enough for grief to harden into permanence. But grief does not disappear when ignored. It seeks structure, leaving the East behind. In 1884, Sarah Winchester traveled west to California. The reasons were practical. The climate was healthier. Distance offered anonymity. The West allowed reinvention. She purchased a modest farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley, near what would later become San Jose. It was not mysterious. It was not grand. It had 8 rooms. Nothing about it suggested obsession. At least not yet. Building as distraction. Construction began almost immediately. At first, the changes were logical. Sarah expanded rooms, added windows, improved comfort. Builders were hired. Work progressed, then did not stop. Year after year, additions continued. Rooms multiplied. Hallways twisted. Staircases rose and fell without destination. What looked chaotic from the outside had an internal consistency that few understood. Sarah Winchester was not building randomly. She was building continuously. The myth arrives early. Almost immediately, stories began to form. Neighbors whispered. Workers speculated. Journalists exaggerated. By the early 20th century, a single explanation dominated. Sarah Winchester was building to appease the ghosts of those killed by Winchester rifles. It is a compelling story. It is also unsupported by evidence. What the records actually show: there is no diary entry, no letter, no documented statement. Sarah Winchester never wrote that she feared ghosts. She never publicly claimed to communicate with spirits. No contemporary source confirms the infamous seance narrative. What does exist are building records, receipts, contracts, and eyewitness accounts from workers. They show a woman deeply involved in construction decisions, materials, and design, often pragmatic, sometimes eccentric, but never irrational. The myth says she was afraid. The evidence suggests she was occupied. Control in a world that took everything. Grief often manifests as a need for control. Sarah Winchester had lost all control over the most important aspects of her life. Death had arrived without permission. Wealth had arrived without meaning. But a building? A building could be directed. Walls could be moved. Rooms could be reshaped. Plans could be altered endlessly. The house became a space where nothing was final. And for someone living with unresolved loss, that mattered. An estate without an ending. Over decades, the house expanded into a labyrinth of more than 160 rooms. Doors opened onto walls. Stairs ended at ceilings. Windows overlooked interiors. This was not madness. It was process without conclusion. Sarah Winchester did not believe in finishing. Finishing meant stopping. Stopping meant facing what she had lost. The woman behind the legend. Despite popular portrayals, Sarah Winchester was not erratic. She was intelligent, well-read, multilingual, and deeply interested in architecture, design, and innovation. The house included advanced features, early elevators, indoor plumbing, and seismic reinforcements. She was experimenting, not hiding, a life defined by movement. Sarah lived in the house, but she never claimed it as complete. Rooms were constantly altered, structures removed as quickly as they were built. Nothing was sacred, not even her own designs. The house was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to continue. The first misunderstanding. The greatest misunderstanding about the Winchester Mystery House is this. It assumes intention must equal explanation. But some structures exist not to be understood, but to be inhabited by process. Sarah Winchester did not leave a manifesto. She left a building that reflects what happens when grief meets unlimited resources and no external constraint. The question the house asks, before ghosts, before legends, before tourism, the Winchester Mystery House asks a simpler question. What happens when a person with infinite means has no reason to stop building? If there is one fact that defines Winchester Mystery House, it is this. Construction never stopped. For nearly 38 years, from the mid-1880s until Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, the sound of hammers, saws, and footsteps echoed through the house almost every day. This alone has fueled decades of speculation. But continuous construction does not automatically mean chaos. To understand why the house kept growing, one must first understand how it was built and how Sarah Winchester lived inside it. A construction site that was also a home. Unlike grand estates built in phases and then completed, the Winchester house existed in a constant state of modification. Sarah Winchester lived inside an active construction site. This was not common, even among the wealthy. Workers did not arrive to build a finished vision. They arrived to respond to daily instructions. Some days walls were added. Other days they were removed. Rooms were reconfigured. Staircases altered. Importantly, nothing suggests urgency. There was no deadline. There was no final plan. That absence of pressure shaped everything. How construction actually worked. Contrary to popular myth, there was no single team building blindly according to superstition. Construction followed a practical system. A small group of trusted carpenters and craftsmen. Ongoing payroll records. Material orders placed regularly. Incremental design changes. Sarah Winchester was deeply involved. She reviewed details, requested changes, and paid promptly. Workers later recalled her as polite, reserved, and decisive. There is no record of her demanding impossible tasks or referencing spirits. The house was not built in secrecy. It was built in routine. Why there were no blueprints? One of the most misunderstood facts is that the Winchester house had no master blueprint. This is often framed as evidence of madness. In reality, it was a method. By avoiding a final plan, Sarah ensured the house could change freely. Rooms could be added without concern for symmetry. Structures could be removed without consequence. The house functioned like a sketchbook, drawn and redrawn endlessly. This approach was unusual, but unusual does not mean irrational. Architecture is process, not product. Most buildings are designed to reach completion. The Winchester house was designed to remain unfinished. Walls were temporary. Hallways were negotiable. Floors were experimental. This explains features often labeled nonsensical. Stairs that rise too high or too low. Doors that open onto walls. Windows placed where views make no sense. These are not mistakes. They were byproducts of revision. When plans change repeatedly, remnants remain. The earthquake that changed everything. In 1906, a powerful earthquake struck Northern California. It severely damaged the Winchester house. Entire sections collapsed. Chimneys fell. Upper floors were destroyed. Portions of the house became unsafe. This moment is critical. After the earthquake, Sarah Winchester did not rebuild everything. She sealed off damaged areas permanently. Rooms were closed. Staircases ended abruptly. Former entrances became dead ends. What looks intentional today was often reactive. The house's labyrinthine quality increased not because of design, but because of disaster. Why some rooms make no sense. Many of the house's strangest features existed only briefly. Rooms were built then altered. Corridors were rerouted. Staircases were shortened after damage. Visitors today see the final state of a constantly evolving structure and assume it was always meant to look this way. It was not. The house is a fossil record of decisions layered over decades. Wealth without limitation. Sarah Winchester's fortune allowed this process to continue indefinitely. She received a daily income from Winchester Arms stock, estimated at over $1,000 per day at the time, equivalent to tens of thousands today. This meant no financial pressure, no need to justify expense, no external oversight. The house answered only to her, and she did not need it to end. Movement as coping. Psychologists often describe grief as energy without direction. Sarah Winchester directed hers into motion. As long as the house changed, life did too. Construction provided rhythm. Mornings with workers, decisions to make, progress to observe. Stopping would have meant stillness. Stillness would have meant confronting loss. A house without a center. Traditional homes have a core, an organizing principle. The Winchester house does not. It expanded outward in response to immediate needs, not overarching vision. New wings formed without regard for balance. Rooms connected where space allowed. This made the house impossible to fully understand spatially, but it also made it adaptable. The myth of deliberate confusion. One popular claim is that Sarah built confusing layouts to trap ghosts. There is no evidence for this. What exists instead is a pattern of constant modification combined with post-earthquake damage. Confusion emerged naturally. It was not designed, living inside impermanence. Sarah Winchester did not move through the house randomly. She knew it intimately. She used specific rooms daily. She avoided others. The house may have been confusing to outsiders, but it was familiar to her. Impermanence was not disorienting to someone who controlled it. The house as extension of mind. Over time, the Winchester house became less like a building and more like a physical process. It reflected indecision, revision, refusal to finalize. This does not require belief in ghosts. It requires belief in grief. What the house was not. It was not built overnight. It was not built without logic. It was not built in terror. It was built slowly, deliberately, and continuously by a woman who had no reason to stop. The growing gap between fact and story. As the house expanded, so did public curiosity. Journalists embellished. Visitors speculated. Neighbors invented explanations. By the early 1900s, the house had already begun to outgrow its reality. The myth was catching up, an unfinished question. The Winchester house did not grow because it needed to be larger. It grew because ending was optional. And when ending is optional, continuation becomes its own purpose. To step inside Winchester Mystery House is to encounter architecture that seems to resist explanation. Staircases that rise and stop. Doors that open into walls. Windows positioned where no view exists. These features have been labeled irrational, haunted, even insane. But architecture does not exist in isolation. It exists in time. And when time is ignored, meaning collapses. The illusion of intentional absurdity. Most visitors assume the house was designed exactly as it appears today. This assumption is the source of nearly every misunderstanding. The Winchester house is not a single design. It is 38 years of revisions layered on top of one another. Rooms were added, altered, and removed. Floors were raised. Ceilings were lowered. Wings were expanded, then sealed. What looks deliberate today is often the residue of earlier decisions. Architecture without context always looks irrational. Staircases that lead nowhere. Perhaps the most famous feature is the staircase to nowhere. It rises gently, step by step, and then stops abruptly at a ceiling. This staircase was not meant to end that way. Before the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, it led to a higher floor. When the earthquake damaged upper levels, Sarah Winchester sealed off unstable sections rather than rebuild them. The staircase was shortened, not symbolic, not mystical, but structural. What visitors see today is a fragment, not a message. Doors that open into walls. Several doors in the house open directly into walls or drop-offs. Again, these were not designed as traps. They once led to rooms or balconies that were later removed or closed off due to structural changes, safety concerns, design revisions. The doors remained because removing them served no purpose. The house was never curated for outsiders. It was lived in during transformation. Windows that look inward. Some windows open into other rooms. Others face hallways. These features are often cited as evidence of confusion. In reality, they reflect a lack of finality. Rooms were subdivided. Hallways were rerouted. Windows that once faced outdoors found themselves enclosed by later additions. Architecture assume permanence. The Winchester house refused it. Floors that change height. Visitors often notice subtle but constant changes in floor level. This is not accidental. The house expanded outward and upward without resetting base levels. New wings were added to old foundations. Floors were raised to accommodate new plumbing or lowered after earthquake damage. Instead of standardizing levels, Sarah Winchester allowed variation. It was easier, and she did not care about uniformity. The myth of deliberate confusion. A persistent legend claims Sarah Winchester intentionally built confusing layouts to disorient spirits. There is no evidence for this. No written account. No witness testimony. No recorded belief. What exists instead is a practical explanation. When you modify a structure continuously without a master plan, coherence dissolves naturally. Confusion was an outcome, not a goal. The number obsession narrative. Another popular myth suggests Sarah was obsessed with the number 13. While it is true that some features include 13 elements, steps, windows, hooks, this pattern is exaggerated. Many claims are selective. Buildings of this size contain thousands of design elements. Finding repetition is inevitable. Highlighting only those that fit a narrative creates false intent. Sarah Winchester never documented a belief in numerology. The house does not support systematic patterning. Secrecy versus privacy. The Winchester house is often described as secretive. In truth, it was private. Workers entered daily. Materials arrived openly. The house was not hidden from view. What was private was Sarah Winchester herself. She avoided publicity. She avoided explanation. She did not correct rumors. Silence was misread as secrecy. A house built for one person. Another mistake is assuming the house was meant to function for guests. It was not. Sarah Winchester designed spaces for herself first. She used a limited number of rooms consistently. Many areas were transitional or experimental. A building optimized for one inhabitant does not prioritize clarity. It prioritizes control. Innovation disguised as eccentricity. While critics focus on oddities, they often overlook innovation. The house featured early indoor plumbing, advanced ventilation, an early elevator, seismic reinforcements. Sarah Winchester adopted new technologies quickly and tested them extensively. Innovation without aesthetic concern often looks strange. But strange does not mean misguided. The problem with finished buildings imply certainty. They imply that all decisions are correct and final. The Winchester house rejects that premise. It remains a record of ongoing decision-making. This is uncomfortable to observers because it denies closure. Why the house feels unsettling. The house feels unsettling not because it is haunted, but because it violates architectural expectations. Humans expect symmetry, logic, orientation. The Winchester house offers none reliably. This creates cognitive dissonance. The brain interprets dissonance as threat. Fear follows, a space that reflects inner process. Architecture often reflects psychology unintentionally. In this case, the house reflects repetition, revision, avoidance of finality. These are not signs of insanity. They are signs of grief lived over time with unlimited means. A building that refuses summary. You cannot summarize the Winchester house. Every attempt to explain it fully fails, because it was never meant to be understood all at once. It was meant to be lived through day by day, change by change, when meaning is added after the fact. Most interpretations of the house were applied after Sarah Winchester's death. Tour guides, writers, and filmmakers needed a narrative. Ghosts were easier than psychology. Mystery was easier than patience. Architecture as evidence, not explanation. The house does not explain itself. It records behavior. And the behavior it records is not fear, but continuation. The question architecture leaves us. The Winchester house asks an uncomfortable question. If you never have to stop building, should you? No part of the Winchester Mystery House story has been more influential or more misleading than the ghost narrative. It is the version most people know. It is also the version least supported by evidence. To understand how the house became synonymous with spirits, seances, and curses, we must look not at Sarah Winchester's life, but at what happened after her silence. The origin of the seance story. The most famous claim is that Sarah Winchester held nightly seances to communicate with spirits killed by Winchester rifles, and that these spirits instructed her to keep building. This story is repeated so often it feels ancient. It is not. There is no contemporary evidence that Sarah Winchester conducted seances. No diary entries, no letters, no statements from servants or workers, no newspaper account from her lifetime. The seance narrative appears decades after her death, when the house was already a curiosity and needed explanation. Why seances were an easy answer. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualism was popular, especially among grieving families. Seances were widely known cultural practices. This made the story plausible. Plausible does not mean true. When faced with a wealthy widow, an unusual house, and unexplained architecture, the public reached for the most available explanation. Ghosts filled the gap where documentation was missing. What Sarah Winchester actually believed. Sarah Winchester was raised in a traditional, educated environment. She was well-read, interested in design, and practical in her habits. There is no record of her publicly identifying as a spiritualist. She did not host public seances. She did not write about spirits. She did not invite mediums to document rituals. Her privacy was interpreted as secrecy. Her silence was interpreted as confession. How the house attracted supernatural labels. After Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, the house was open to the public. This moment changed everything. Guides needed stories. Visitors wanted mystery. Journalists wanted headlines. A house defined by complexity was difficult to explain factually. Ghost stories were easier. They transformed confusion into entertainment. Early tourism and narrative creation. Early tour operators emphasized dark hallways, sealed rooms, old architecture. They framed these features as intentional traps for spirits. This framing worked. Attendance increased. Media attention followed. The house became famous. Accuracy became secondary. The firearms curse narrative. Another layer of myth claims the Winchester family was cursed by the violence their weapons caused. This idea fits modern moral sensibilities, but it does not align with historical behavior. Sarah Winchester never publicly expressed guilt over the rifle business. There is no record of remorse tied to weapon manufacturing. The narrative projects modern ethics backward, imposing contemporary values onto a 19th century context. Fear as entertainment. By the mid-20th century, the Winchester house had transitioned fully from private residence to spectacle. Books exaggerated details. Films dramatized events. Television simplified nuance. Fear sold better than psychology. The house became less about Sarah Winchester and more about audience expectation. Why ghost stories persist? Ghost stories endure because they offer a clear villain, spirits, a clear cause, curse, a clear solution, endless building. Reality offers none of these. Reality offers grief, wealth, privacy, and time. Those are harder to market. The absence of haunting evidence. Despite decades of paranormal claims, no verifiable evidence of haunting has ever been produced. No consistent recordings. No documented investigations with repeatable results. No historical accounts from Sarah's time describing supernatural activity. What exists are anecdotes, often contradictory and unverifiable. The psychology of pattern seeking. Humans are pattern seeking by nature. When confronted with chaos, the brain imposes meaning. The Winchester House provides endless opportunity for misinterpretation. Irregular layouts, unfinished transitions, sealed spaces. These features trigger discomfort. Discomfort invites supernatural explanation. Silence as a blank canvas. Sarah Winchester never defended herself. She never explained her house. She never corrected rumors. This allowed the narrative to evolve without resistance. Silence became permission, when story replaces history. Over time, the ghost narrative became dominant. It overshadowed architectural innovation, earthquake damage, construction practices, grief psychology. The house's real story was simplified into a curse, a myth that refuses to die. Even today, attempts to clarify the truth are often rejected. Visitors prefer mystery. Mystery feels more satisfying than ambiguity. And so the ghost story continues, not because it is true, but because it is useful. What the truth actually is. The Winchester Mystery House is not evidence of haunting. It is evidence of uninterrupted wealth, unresolved grief, architectural freedom, human meaning-making. No spirits required. The danger of romanticizing fear. Turning the house into a haunted attraction trivializes its real history. It reduces Sarah Winchester to a caricature. It ignores the complexity of loss and agency, and it replaces understanding with spectacle. The final misunderstanding. The greatest misunderstanding is this. People think the house was built for ghosts. In reality, it was built for time, to fill it, to occupy it, to prevent it from stopping. When explanation is harder than fiction, truth demands patience. Fiction demands only attention. The Winchester House became famous because fiction was louder. Today, Winchester Mystery House exists in a state few buildings ever reach. It is not abandoned. It is not fully understood. It is not finished. It survives as a place where myth and fact coexist, often uncomfortably, often in conflict. And that tension defines its modern meaning. From private grief to public landmark. After Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, construction stopped immediately. This single fact is critical. If the house had been built out of fear, if it were driven by spirits, curses, or commands, there would have been no reason to stop. Yet the moment Sarah was gone, the hammering ceased. The house did not need her anymore, and she did not need it. Within months, the estate was open to the public. What had once been a private space of control and process became a destination, an object of curiosity. The meaning of the house changed overnight. A building frozen mid-thought. Most historic homes are preserved at a chosen moment. The Winchester House was preserved mid-sentence. Rooms were left incomplete. Transitions were unresolved. Design decisions were never finalized. Visitors today do not see a finished mansion. They see a process interrupted by death. This is what makes the house so unsettling and so unique. Tourism and the reinvention of meaning. Opening the house to visitors required interpretation. Guides needed explanations. Guests wanted coherence. Marketing required narrative. The easiest narrative was mystery. Ghosts explained confusion. Curses explained excess. Seances explained repetition. This framing worked, and it endured. But it came at a cost. What gets lost in the haunted story? When the Winchester House is reduced to a ghost attraction, several truths disappear. Sarah Winchester's agency. The role of grief without pathology. The architectural impact of constant revision. The effect of the 1906 earthquake. The reality of wealth without constraint. The haunted narrative simplifies a complex human story into spectacle, and spectacle rarely respects nuance. The house as psychological artifact, viewed without myth, the Winchester house becomes something far more interesting. It is a psychological artifact. It records what happens when loss removes future orientation, wealth removes limits, privacy removes accountability. The house is not evidence of madness. It is evidence of freedom without conclusion. Why the house still feels alive. Despite being over a century old, the Winchester house feels strangely active, not because of spirits, but because of incompletion. Humans are uncomfortable with unfinished things. We expect closure. We expect order. The Winchester house denies both. It invites movement without destination, and that feels alive. Preservation without resolution. Unlike other historic homes, the Winchester house cannot be restored to an original state. There is no original state. Any attempt to impose order would falsify its history. Preservation here means maintaining complexity, not eliminating it. This makes the house rare. It resists simplification, even now. A building that exposes our need for explanation. The enduring popularity of the house reveals more about visitors than about Sarah Winchester. We want causes, villains, endings. The Winchester house offers none. It presents accumulation without purpose, motion without goal, architecture without final meaning. And that unsettles us. Why the myths will never fully disappear. Even with historical research, documentation, and reinterpretation, the myths persist. Not because they are true, but because they are useful. They make the house consumable. They allow visitors to feel something quickly. Understanding takes longer. A different kind of legacy. Sarah Winchester did not set out to create a monument. She did not write a philosophy. She left behind something more honest. A structure that records time spent coping rather than time spent conquering. The house does not glorify wealth. It reveals its emptiness, what the house ultimately represents. The Winchester Mystery House is not about ghosts. It is about what happens when stopping is optional, when resources are infinite, when loss is unresolved, when no external force demands completion. The result is not chaos. It is continuation, standing without explanation. Today, the house stands exactly as it was left, not corrected, not rationalized, not redeemed. It does not defend itself. It does not clarify. It simply exists. The final truth. The Winchester house does not ask to be believed. It asks to be observed. And what it shows clearly, quietly, is that architecture can become a record of inner life without ever intending to. The house that never needed ghosts. In the end, the most unsettling realization is this. The Winchester Mystery House is compelling without the paranormal, because its real story of grief, wealth, and endless motion is something far closer to us than any ghost could be.